Bendiahuit. I'm Ace Harvey. I am a hard polytheist, a Irish Reconstructionist, and a devotee of the Morrigan. I am also a comparative religion student, although I may be changing my major. But I do have some classes under my belt, and I'm also very passionate about theistic debate. So one particularly interesting argument that I don't hear very often, and I honestly thought was dead for a while, is the idea that all religions, including Catholicism, actually derive from a story about Nimrod, Samiramis, and Tammuz. I didn't think that this was still around, but apparently it is. So in response to that, I've done some research and making this video. So the story goes something vaguely like this. Tammuz was this really bad guy. He was a ruler of Babylon, and him and his wife, Samiramis, built the city of Babylon, which apparently was the first city in the world, which is inaccurate, along with many other things. But Nimrod was eventually killed, and he was cut into pieces, and the pieces were sent to different parts of the world. Of course, this is similar to the Osirian cycle in Kemetic mythology, which is exactly what they're claiming, that this story became part of Egyptian mythology, Kemetic mythology, and found its way into Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and then the rest of the world, and that all other religions derive from this. Of course, this is horribly inaccurate. In fact, there is no biblical or historic support for this narrative. Also, Tammuz was allegedly the son of Semiramis, and also the reincarnation of Nimrod. It is mentioned that Nimrod becomes Utu, the Sumerian or Babylonian sun god, and it also is mentioned that Semiramis makes an obelisk in honor of Nimrod, who is also the sun god of Babylon, Egypt, and every sun god ever. So this story is actually pretty new. It actually comes about in the mid-1800s in a book called The Two Babylons by a man named Alexander Hislop. Hislop, in turn, seems to get a lot of his information from Diodorus Siculus, who was a Greek historian whose methods were pretty shaky. He tended to blend history with mythology. And he is referring to Semiramis, who was not a Babylonian queen in the sense of the city of Babylon and Sumer, but an Azarian queen after Babylon was taken over by the Azarians. And we're talking about the Chaldean Babylonian Empire, which happens much later. By this time, Egyptian mythology was well established, and her building of a obelisk, which was actually to honor herself, not any of her husbands, was probably more inspired by Egypt rather than the other way around. So there's that. Also, the fact that Chapter 10 Genesis does not make any reference whatsoever to Nimrod being married to Semiramis. Tammuz is a Sumerian Babylonian god, but has no association with Nimrod or Semiramis. So this is basically a case of taking vague mentions of names in the Bible and coming up with a whole story surrounding them. Which is interesting because a lot of these things are derived from people who have a tendency to not like anything occult or Masonic, and it's vaguely similar to what the Masons do with Hiram Abiff when you think about it, so it's a little ironic, but there you go. It is also mentioned that they referred to Nimrod as Baal, which in Sumerian just means Lord. It's very similar to Baal or Baal in Canaanite, which also happens to be in Hebrew. And actually, the Abrahamic God is also at one point referred to as Baal in 2 Samuel 5:20, when King David names a place Baal Perazim, meaning the Lord who breaks through. So it is a title, not an actual god, although when you refer to Baal as a god, you're usually referring to the Ugaritic Baal, which in the Ugaritic cycle is a Canaanite storm god. So, he's around, but usually it's actually a title that can be applied to many different gods. It's kind of interesting that a story about the Sumerians and Babylonians doesn't really have a whole lot mentioning anything about Sumerian or Babylonian mythology. It seems like the apparent founders of Babylon had no influence whatsoever on Babylonian mythology, but all the influence in the world on Egyptian mythology, which really doesn't make sense, and I'm kind of surprised that nobody seems to notice this. There's very few references to Babylonian mythology at all. They seem to focus mostly on Egyptian mythology and the Osirian cycle at that. And that's really not all there is to say about Egyptian mythology, really. There's more than one cosmogony in Egyptian mythology. There are conflicting myths in Egyptian mythology, depending on what time period and what part of Egypt you're talking about. Most notably the Ogdoad and the Ennead, the 9 or 8 creator deities in these two conflicting cosmogonies. Atum was actually a creator deity, a demiurge in some of these stories himself. He was later worshipped as Amun-Ra. But these stories that also say that the obelisk is Nimrod's phallus are just plain inaccurate. It was actually a reference to the primordial mound in the Atum cosmogony. The Atum stands on top of. So it's an oversimplification of very vaguely understood mythology, and an attempt to try and compare all of these myths and make them seem like they're all talking about the same individual. But there again, not all polytheistic religions have a sun god. For example, what is it? In Japanese Shinto, they have a sun goddess, for example. And it's hard to say who the central character in Irish mythology is. So it's really hard to say, oh, well, this person in Irish mythology is Nimrod. It doesn't really work that way. They also compare Nimrod and Osiris to Dionysus and say that these are all Nimrod. But while the motif of the dying and resurrecting God is common, it's usually tied in with a natural cycle. And the actual details of these deities are vastly different from each other. Really, the only similarity that you have is the fact that they died and were resurrected. I mean, it's like saying that if two people did the same thing, They must be the same person, regardless of anything else different in their lives. It's a horrible way to try and connect these things. And it neglects differences. So if you are a pagan and you come across this argument, or you're a Catholic and you're told that your religion is of Babylon, just remember that this actually derives in the mid-1800s by a man named Alexander Hislop, and that his history and mythology was very shaky, and he pretty much made the story up. If you are a Christian, a Protestant, obviously, and using this argument, please stop. You look like a fool. So anyway, that's all I have to say. Shalom.